If Bitcoin drops to zero, where would the first shock be felt? A sudden fall of Bitcoin to $0 would instantly paralyze the entire crypto ecosystem. Because Bitcoin is not just an asset, it's also the heart of the crypto universe. Its collapse erases the credibility of everything from Ethereum to the smallest altcoin. Exchanges would shut down, billions of dollars would vanish. As people realized the zero number on their screens, panic would deepen not only in wallets, but also in minds. Psychologically, this shock experienced by investors is perceived as the destruction of a dream they believed in, beyond just sudden losses. The human mind struggles to accept a value that's been reduced to zero. This creates a collective trauma. How would the global financial system react to this collapse? Banks, funds, and large investment firms would be dragged into a crisis of confidence following Bitcoin's drop to zero. Many institutions hold Bitcoin in their portfolios or have crypto-linked investments. The sudden loss would deepen balance sheet gaps. Some institutions might even face bankruptcy risks. On a psychological level, this changes how investors view the concept of a safe haven. The desire to take risks disappears. People turn to gold, government bonds, or even cash. The whole market moves with a not-losing reflex. How would governments approach this development? Many governments would interpret Bitcoin's collapse as a warning. They would blame crypto, pass new laws, and thoroughly regulate decentralized finance. Some countries would wrestle with major economic problems due to crypto-linked losses in their budgets. What's interesting here is the psychological attitude of political authorities. Bitcoin's disappearance is, in fact, a regaining of control for states. Central banks and governments would reinforce their power by saying, "See, the dream of digital freedom was unreliable." How would the technology world be affected? Bitcoin was more than just a financial tool. It was also the pioneer of technologies like blockchain, NFT, Web3, and the metaverse. Its disappearance would shake confidence in these areas. Projects wouldn't get funding, startups would withdraw, user interest would decline. Psychologically, this is a future shock. People would see the vision of digital transformation, talked about for years, collapse in an instant. This reinforces the belief in collective consciousness that trusting technology too much is risky. What psychological impact would it create in society? Millions of people who invested in Bitcoin would lose their fortunes overnight. Beyond that, large groups would feel deceived. A dream of financial freedom would turn into a nightmare. The disappointment would create a deep emotional collapse, not just material. In psychology, this can be called a collective grieving process. People feel anger, despair, and guilt because they lost not only their money, but also their faith and hopes. Social distrust grows. Protests against the financial system and new social movements emerge. How would traditional finance benefit from this? Bitcoin falling to zero would mean a victory for the traditional banking system. Central banks reinforce their power. State-backed digital currencies spread rapidly. Investors return to classic assets like the dollar, euro, and gold. Psychologically, this activates people's subconscious trust in the old reflex. Individuals afraid of uncertainty seek the safety of what's familiar. This creates greater resistance to financial innovation. How would Bitcoin's drop to zero be remembered in history? If such a scenario occurs, the collapse of Bitcoin would go down in history as the biggest bubble of the digital age. It would take its place among economic crises like the 17th century tulip mania or the Great Depression of 1929. However, psychologically, this collapse would be a collective lesson. Humanity would learn to question technological hopes more carefully. Future digital projects would be forced to proceed with stricter regulations and more transparency. What alternatives would emerge after the collapse? Bitcoin's disappearance doesn't mean the end of all digital finance. The infrastructure it created would continue to evolve in other forms. State-backed digital currencies, regulated blockchain solutions, and safer crypto models would emerge. On a psychological level, this is a rebirth process. Although people would not forget the trauma they experienced, over time they would approach new financial technologies in a more controlled way. Trust would be rebuilt, but never as easily as before. Is it the end of a dream or a new beginning? Bitcoin dropping to zero is not just a financial loss. It's a deep break in humanity's understanding of trust, technology, and freedom. For some experts, this scenario is almost impossible. For others, it's as realistic as the bubble inevitably bursting. For example, some traditional financiers emphasize that Bitcoin is built on baseless value and is not backed by any government or real asset. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman has repeatedly called Bitcoin one of the biggest bubbles of the 21st century. Similarly, Warren Buffett has described Bitcoin as rat poison squared, arguing that its value could approach zero in the long term. On the other hand, many technology advocates strongly oppose these views. For them, Bitcoin represents the future of global finance thanks to its decentralized structure. However, if the scenario of dropping to zero happens, it will not only destroy crypto investors, but also their hopes, beliefs, and quest for freedom. This is where the real catastrophe lies. People lose not only their wealth, but also their sense of trust in the future. However, history has shown that every collapse also opens the door to rebirth. While Bitcoin's fall to zero would be the greatest tragedy for decentralized finance, it could also pave the way for new digital systems that are more transparent, auditable, and sustainable. States would promote central bank digital currencies, investors would turn to stronger infrastructures, and societies would approach financial technologies more cautiously, learning lessons from this trauma. In conclusion, Bitcoin dropping to zero would be not just the end of a currency, but also a zero point in humanity's sense of hope. But this reset can also be the first step to a new beginning. If you want to see more content like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think would happen to the world if Bitcoin dropped to zero? I'd love to hear your opinions. Let's meet in the comments.